talking about here on my channel. Right now, it's all about.
It was shaping up to be one of those days where everything seemed to collide at once: headlines, rumors, legal twists, and the kind of courtroom drama that doesn't just stay inside the courthouse but spills into the public eye, dragging reputations and narratives along with it. Lars Harry stepped into the moment with the kind of urgency that only comes when you know something big is unfolding, something people are going to be talking about long after the day ends. What started as a routine update quickly turned into something far more explosive, because this wasn't just another development, this was a shift in momentum. The ongoing legal battle between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively had already been messy, layered, and full of speculation, but now, for the first time in a while, it felt like the scales were tipping, and not subtly either. A judge had just handed Baldoni multiple wins in a single stretch, and in legal terms, that's never small. It doesn't guarantee victory in the end, but it changes the energy of the entire case. It gives one side confidence and forces the other into a position where every move suddenly matters more than before. Lars Harry didn't rush past it. He paused on that point because it deserved attention. When a judge starts siding with one party repeatedly, even in smaller rulings, it creates a ripple effect. Lawyers are just strategies. Public perception begins to shift. Even insiders start whispering differently. And right now, Baldoni's team had every reason to feel like they were finally gaining ground after what had been a chaotic and highly publicized fight. There was also the statement from Brian Friedman, a name that carries weight in legal circles, especially in cases that blend celebrity, media, and reputation. When someone like Friedman speaks, it's not just commentary, it's calculated messaging. Every word is chosen to reinforce a position, to frame the narrative in a way that strengthens the client's stance. And in this case, the tone coming from Baldoni's side wasn't defensive anymore, it was confident, almost as if they believed the tide had genuinely turned. But before diving deeper into that legal storm, there was another story weaving its way through the conversation, something that, on the surface, seemed completely different but was pulling massive attention in its own right. The viral sensation known as Love Trapped had exploded far beyond expectations. What started as a podcast had quickly turned into a phenomenon, climbing rankings at a pace that even industry insiders didn't see coming. And when Lars Harry brought up the numbers, it wasn't just impressive, it was shocking. Sitting at number 11 across all podcasts in the country wasn't just a milestone, it was a statement. This wasn't a niche success or a temporary spike. It was competing with giants, standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the most established names in the entire podcasting world. That kind of rise doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a story captures people, when it taps into something that keeps audiences coming back, episode after episode. There was a certain disbelief in how quickly it had all unfolded. Breaking download records, drawing in new listeners by the thousands, and now expanding beyond its original plan, it was clear that Love Trapped had struck a nerve. What was supposed to be an 8-episode run was now being extended to 12, not because they needed filler, but because the story itself refused to stay contained. There was too much to unpack, too many layers still hidden beneath the surface, and that's the thing about stories like this: once people get invested, they don't just want answers, they want every detail. They want to understand the motivations, the secrets, the moments that weren't supposed to be seen. And when a podcast delivers that in a way that feels raw and real, it stops being just content and starts becoming something bigger, something that people talk about, share, and speculate on. For Lars Harry, being part of that journey wasn't just exciting, it was surreal. There's a difference between creating something and watching it take on a life of its own. And right now, that's exactly what was happening. The idea of it eventually turning into a full documentary didn't even feel far-fetched anymore. In fact, it felt inevitable. But as big as that story was, the courtroom drama waiting just around the corner demanded attention. Because this wasn't just about headlines, this was about serious allegations, legal strategies, and decisions that could reshape how the entire case unfolds. The focus shifted back to Justin Baldoni and a development that, in many ways, might end up being one of the most important turning points so far. A judge had officially allowed a defamation claim to move forward, and not just any claim, but one tied directly to Baldoni's former publicist, Stephanie Jones. From the beginning, there had been whispers that Jones was at the center of something bigger, something that connected multiple threads of the case. Now, those whispers were starting to look more like a structured argument. According to Baldoni's team, Jones had made statements that weren't just misleading but damaging, statements that painted a picture of retaliation and smear campaigns that, if proven false, could carry serious consequences. The details were complicated, layered with claims about private messages, alleged misconduct, and the way information was obtained and shared. There were suggestions that certain actions, like subpoenas, may not have been used in the way people would expect, raising questions about intent and legitimacy. It wasn't just messy, it was potentially explosive, and that's why the judge's decision mattered so much. Allowing a defamation claim to proceed doesn't mean it's proven, but it means there's enough there to take seriously. Enough to say this isn't something that can be dismissed and forgotten. It has to be examined, argued, and ultimately decided. For Baldoni's side, that's a win, a clear one. It validates their position, at least at this stage, and gives them a path forward to present their case in full. And when you combine that with the judge denying the attempt to dismiss the lawsuit altogether, it becomes even more significant. It's not just survival, it's momentum. The statement from Brian Friedman reflected exactly that. There was a sense of satisfaction, but also a clear intention to push forward, to let the evidence speak and to keep building the case piece by piece. Legal battles like this aren't won in a single moment, they're built through a series of decisions, each one stacking on top of the last, and right now, those decisions were starting to stack in Baldoni's favor. But if there's one thing that defines cases like this, it's that nothing stays simple for long. Just when it seems like one side is gaining control, another complication emerges, and this time, it came in the form of what Baldoni's team described as a document dump. The phrase itself sounds almost harmless until you understand what it means in a legal context. We're not talking about a few extra files or minor additions. We're talking about massive volumes of material, hundreds, sometimes thousands of documents, delivered in a way that can overwhelm the opposing side, especially when deadlines are tight. According to Baldoni's legal team, that's exactly what happened. Blake Lively's side had submitted an enormous amount of material, including close to 1,000 potential exhibits and dozens of possible witnesses. On paper, it might look thorough. But from the defense's perspective, it raised serious concerns about practicality, because in a real trial, you don't present everything. You can't. There isn't enough time, and not everything is even admissible. So when that much material appears all at once, it forces the other side to sift through it, identify what matters, and prepare responses, all while the clock is ticking. It's a strategy that can be interpreted in different ways. Some see it as thorough preparation, leaving no stone unturned. Others see it as a tactic to create pressure, to make the process more difficult for the opposing side. And in this case, Baldoni's team made it clear where they stood. They pushed back, arguing that the volume of material wasn't just excessive but unrealistic for trial purposes. And importantly, the judge agreed, at least to the extent of granting an extension on pre-trial deadlines. That might sound like a small adjustment, but in legal battles, time is everything. Extra time means better preparation, stronger arguments, and fewer mistakes. And once trial, that possibility wasn't just speculation. It was being discussed more and more, especially as the judge's pattern of rulings became clearer. If enough of Blake Lively's claims were dismissed, it could fundamentally change the entire case, or even end it altogether. And that's where things got even more complicated, because sometimes, in situations like this, a dismissal isn't as straightforward as it seems. For one side, it might be a victory. For the other, it might become a different kind of narrative, one that shifts focus away from the courtroom and into the court of public opinion, because in high-profile cases, perception matters almost as much as outcomes. And as Lars Harry continued to break it all down, one thing was clear: this story was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just getting started. As everything continued to unfold, it became clear that this case wasn't just about legal arguments anymore. It was about timing, pressure, and the kind of strategic decisions that can quietly decide outcomes long before a jury ever steps into a courtroom. What Baldoni's team had managed to secure wasn't just a series of favorable rulings, it was breathing room, and in a case moving this fast, that kind of space can be the difference between control and chaos. The issue of the document dump lingered heavily over the proceedings, not just because of its size, but because of what it suggested. Nearly 1,000 potential exhibits and over 40 witnesses isn't just preparation, it's a signal. It tells the court, and the opposing side, that this isn't going to be a narrow case. It's going to be expansive, layered, and potentially overwhelming. But there's a fine line between being thorough and being excessive, and Baldoni's team leaned hard into that distinction. They argued that no jury would realistically see even half of that material, and more importantly, that a large portion of it might not even be admissible in the first place. That's where the real tension sits, because if evidence can't be used in court, then what purpose does it serve other than to complicate preparation? From a defense standpoint, it starts to look less like a search for truth and more like an attempt to bury key details under sheer volume. The judge's response, granting additional time and adjusting the schedule, didn't outright condemn Lively's approach, but it acknowledged the imbalance it created. And once again, even without dramatic language or sweeping declarations, the decision leaned in Baldoni's favor. These are the kinds of incremental shifts that don't always make explosive headlines, but inside the legal world, they're watched closely. Patterns matter. Judges are consistent in ways that reveal more than any single ruling ever could, and right now, that pattern was becoming harder to ignore. At the center of all this sits a much bigger question, one that could potentially end the entire case before it fully begins. The possibility of dismissal. It's something that had been floating around as speculation early on, almost dismissed by some as wishful thinking from Baldoni supporters. But now, with each passing development, it didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. If the judge decides that key elements of Blake Lively's claims don't hold up, whether due to lack of evidence, legal technicalities, or procedural issues, parts of the case could be stripped away. And if enough of those pieces fall, the structure itself starts to collapse. That's the scenario Baldoni's team is clearly pushing toward, but here's where it gets complicated in a way that only high-profile cases can. A dismissal doesn't just end legal proceedings, it creates a new narrative battlefield. Because while one side might walk away with a technical victory, the other side isn't left without options. In fact, sometimes a case ending early becomes its own story, one that can be framed, interpreted, and reshaped depending on who controls the public conversation. There's already talk, and it's not coming from just one corner, that if the case were dismissed, it could be spun as something larger than the facts themselves. That it could be portrayed as a system failure, or bias, or something that prevented the full story from being told. In other words, losing in court doesn't always mean losing in the broader narrative, and that's what makes this entire situation so unpredictable. Because while lawyers argue motions and judges issue rulings, there's another layer playing out in real time, public opinion. And once that starts to solidify, it can be incredibly difficult to shift. Lars Harry understood that balance better than most. The way people consume these stories isn't always rooted in legal detail. It's emotional, instinctive. Whoever's version of events reaches them first often sticks the strongest. And in a case involving recognizable names, established fan bases, and media coverage that stretches across platforms, those early impressions can be powerful. That's why, even with Baldoni stacking wins on the legal side, it doesn't automatically translate to a complete shift in how people see the situation. There are audiences firmly planted on both sides, and for many of them, no single ruling is going to change their perspective. That's the reality of cases like this. They don't just divide facts, they divide people still. Momentum matters. And right now, Baldoni has it. The conversation inevitably circled back to something that had been underestimated at the very beginning of all this, the idea that the case might actually go the distance. Early predictions leaned heavily toward settlement. It's what usually happens, especially when reputations, finances, and careers are all on the line. Settling avoids risk. It keeps things contained. It prevents unpredictable outcomes, but that didn't account for one major factor, e.g. in Hollywood, reputation isn't just important, it's everything. And when that reputation is challenged publicly, especially in a way that threatens long-term career impact, walking away quietly isn't always an option. Sometimes, the need to be proven right outweighs the practical benefits of settling. And when both sides feel that way, you end up exactly where this case is now, heading straight toward a potential courtroom showdown for Baldoni. The stakes are clear. His career took a hit the moment this controversy exploded. Projects stalled, opportunities disappeared, and the narrative surrounding his name shifted almost overnight. From his perspective, fighting back isn't just about winning a case, it's about reclaiming that narrative, piece by piece. And for Lively, the stakes are just as significant. even if they play out differently. Public image, credibility, and influence all sit on the line. In a world where perception can shape future opportunities, backing down carries its own risks. So neither side moves lightly. Every decision is calculated, every filing deliberate, and yet, even in the middle of all this intensity, there are moments where the human side of it all slips through. The unpredictability, the pressure, the way it seeps into everyday life. Lars Harry, in his own way, let that come through, the small, almost absurd contrasts between something as serious as a legal battle and something as simple as standing in your kitchen, staring at an empty container of ice cream you swore you'd only eat half of. It's those moments that ground everything. Because as massive as these stories feel, as all-consuming as they become, life keeps moving in the background. People still deal with ordinary frustrations, still find themselves caught between big headlines and small realities, but the headlines weren't slowing down. If anything, they were accelerating. The legal filings, the courtroom decisions, the speculation, it was all building toward something. A turning point, a defining moment that would decide where this story ultimately lands. And as the timeline tightened, with key dates approaching and pressure mounting on both sides, one thing became impossible to ignore: whatever happens next isn't going to be minor. It's going to shape everything that follows, because cases like this don't fade quietly. They end with impact, whether that impact comes from a courtroom verdict, a sudden dismissal, or an unexpected twist that no one sees coming. That part hasn't been written yet, but it's coming.